It's time for episode 24 of the Mystical Times blog podcast with me, Michelle Eve. This Halloween episode is called The Poltergeist of Byron Street, and it's a lesser talked about historic case. But before I share this strange case with you, I want to hear from you if you've ever had a spooky experience. You can email me here, spooky@mysticaltimesblog.com. This case happened in the Cheshire town of Runcorn in the early 1950s, and it had many witnesses, lots of interventions by different groups, and the activity was also witnessed at other addresses. The activity was to last for around 12 weeks. All the information about this case has come from reports that the local newspapers published, with some of the reporters who remained unnamed experiencing some of the poltergeist activities and events, and many interviews with those who were to experience these highly unusual events. It was on August the 29th, 1952, that a local newspaper, the Runcorn Weekly News, first published the strange goings-on at the terraced house, 1 Byron Street. Byron Street was, and still is, a typical terraced street, not far from the Runcorn Cemetery. The family members of the house were Samuel Jones, aged 68, who lived at the address for 35 years, his grandson, John Glynn, who was 16, John's 8-year-old sister, and Samuel's sister-in-law, Lucy Jones. They also had temporary house guests, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, son and daughter-in-law of Mrs. Lucy Jones. Mr. and Mrs. Jones were planning on moving from Wales to Runcorn, and they slept in the living room. John and his grandfather shared a bedroom, as did Lucy and John's sister. There was also a lodger living in the house, a woman in her 50s, called Ellen Whittle. At the time of this newspaper report, the household had endured 4 nights of poltergeist activity, making them want to leave the premises, but instead they ended up calling the police. The poltergeist activity had started just a few weeks ago and had been sporadic at first, but it had really ramped up. The epicentre of the poltergeist activity seems to be John and Samuel's bedroom, where furniture would be moved and books thrown to the floor, all done by invisible means. Other residents in the local area would even knock at the door of number 1 Byron Street and would be invited in to witness the strange happenings. One neighbour, Mr. Watson, had witnessed the dressing table being moved in the bedroom, along with John himself and John's friend John Berry. Across the hallway, other interested neighbours and friends were waiting in one of the other bedrooms. In the bedroom, they turned the light off, as did the bedroom across the landing, and everyone waited. After several minutes, the heavy dressing room table was heard being dragged along the floor. As soon as the bedroom light came on, the activity stopped. The men pushed the heavy dressing room table back to its original place, placed a glass tumbler on top, and then the lights were turned off again. Several moments later, they heard the piece of furniture move along the floor, so turned the light back on, and found it had moved over a foot more than the first time, and that the glass tumbler remained intact where they had placed it. Mr. Watson told the reporter he would never try and sleep in that bedroom, as whatever was happening wouldn't allow for a good night's sleep. He also noted that it would appear that the dressing table was always moved from the right-hand side, as though, whatever it was, there was only one of them. When the police attended the property, they conducted some tests. They used chalk to mark the position of the dressing table. They too placed the glass tumbler on the dressing table, then turned off the lights. And as soon as they heard the sounds of it being moved, they turned the light back on again. And as they did this, the dressing table stopped moving, and the glass tumbler fell to the floor and smashed. It was reported by others in the property that this smashing sounded as though several glass tumblers had fallen and smashed. This amplified noise would also happen when others were in the house, and noises such as drawers being opened and closed at high speeds were also heard. The police left and made a report, but this report was not made public at the time, but they did comment that there had been no material evidence to show how the furniture moved, so it ceased to be a matter for the police. The residents had told the Runcorn Weekly News reporter that they had been in touch with the publication, the Weekly News, just the week before, but the publication had refrained from publishing about this case. The residents of 1 Byron Street had been in contact with a well-known medium, Philip France, and he had been invited to the house not long after the police visit. Mr. France said to himself that he was going to exorcise the poltergeist, but didn't say that to the residents. It would be the first time the medium had encountered this sort of situation. Mr. France brought along an assistant, and they had both, along with John Glynn, sat in a darkened bedroom. John had asked Mr. France why the light was needed to be switched off, and Mr. France stated that whatever was causing the furniture to move had a message, and by being in the dark, this would allow the message to come through clearly. So the light was switched off, and after half an hour, they heard the dressing table being moved. Mr. France said that the noise of the furniture being moved seemed to be coming from all over the property. It was very amplified, so the light was switched back on, and the dressing table had moved just 1 inch. A lot of noise for such a small movement. On top of the dressing table, there was a Bible, a picture book, a small round tin, and an alarm clock, which was placed on a mat. Again, they turned the light off, and as soon as they did, smashing noises were heard, so the light was switched back on straight away. Everything apart from the alarm clock had been thrown on the floor, and interestingly, the alarm clock was in a different place on top of the dressing table. Mr. France gave the family a reading, but didn't divulge what messages they were given, as they were of a personal nature. It was after Mr. France's visit that the poltergeist activity ceased for a week. When this poltergeist activity was published in the Runcorn Weekly News, other local newspapers were printing news stories about other houses that experienced similar happenings that also had been investigated by the police. There had been a house in South Norwood, London, and one in Blackpool. Both of these had rather violent phenomenon, tipping over heavy furniture, throwing of heavy ornaments, not to mention crockery and cutlery being thrown during the daylight, with many witnesses. The newspaper went on to say that the residents at the property indicated they had some support for spiritualist contentions and thought it was John's father attempting to contact his widow through his son. There had been a strong smell of tobacco during the readings that medium Philip France held at 1 Byron Street, and it was well known that John's father had been a heavy smoker. There had been footsteps heard going up and down the stairs, despite everyone being accounted for in the room where the readings were held. It was said that Mr. France, after giving some confirmed messages to John's mum, he cleared the house of any spiritual activity, as he felt it was John's father causing the strange happenings. As a side note, John's mum, Nora Glynn, lived close by, and there had been some reports of poltergeist activity in her house, but I was unable to find out just what this activity consisted of. The locals were asked what they thought about the strange goings-on, and some people were very sceptical, whilst others were believers, down to those who felt the amplified noises were down to the tattered nerves of those who lived at 1 Byron Street. Some people accepted that these things happened, but had no thought as to why and how. Many people ended up involved with this case and had many theories into why it was happening or how it could be stopped, but where or how did it begin? As this poltergeist case was occurring, there was one element that wasn't made public for another 20 years. There had been an old sandstone farmhouse that was known as Pool Farm, and it had been on the outskirts of Runcorn. It had been there since 1689, and, according to local folklore, the farm had been linked to Norton Abbey by an underground tunnel. The farmhouse was also rumoured to have had a poltergeist too. The farmer was a man called Mr. Crowther, and at the beginning of August 1952, just before the poltergeist activity ramped up at 1 Byron Street, Mr. Crowther saw a peculiar sight. He was walking through the farmyard when he noticed a black cloud, about 10 foot in the sky, and it was heading towards him. The cloud was to stop right in front of him. Then it moved to the side of him and floated on by. He went back into the farmhouse and told his wife. She said she had seen the cloud from the window, and it had disappeared through the wall of the pig shed. It was over the course of the next 2 weeks that 53 of Mr. Crowther's pedigree pigs were to die. The first pig died the day after Mrs. Crowther saw the cloud going into the wall of the pig shed. The pigs were behaving in an erratic way, squealing as they were trying to climb up the walls to the hole in the roof, as though they were trying to escape something unseen. Forensic tests were carried out on the pigs' bodies, but no cause for their premature deaths could be found. They had been healthy and all tested clear for swine fever. The farmer and his wife experienced some poltergeist activity with some strange banging and knocking sounds, but it soon dispersed. A couple of months later, Mr. Crowther was to see the cloud again, but this time it was lighter in colour. He approached it with 2 of his dogs, and the dogs tried to attack the cloud. The cloud just moved out of the way, then it headed off in a southeasterly direction. Mr. Crowther's experiences could have some connections to 1 Byron Street, as he was either a friend of Samuel Jones, or, according to other reports, he employed Samuel as a pigman at the farm. When Samuel told Mr. Crowther about the strange happenings at his home, Mr. Crowther went to the house and witnessed the black cloud inside the property. So was there a connection between the high strangers at Pool Farm and the terraced house? On the 12th of September 1952, the Runcorn Guardian gave an update of 1 Byron Street. The family had a Roman Catholic priest visit the property. On the priest's first visit, he stayed quite some time, but nothing was to happen. When the priest left, the family felt settled, but it wasn't to last long. The dressing table was moved around 8 inches from the bedroom floor. Then the alarm clock was thrown across the room. Books and other items were also disturbed. All these items were placed back into their original places, but then the alarm clock was violently thrown against the foot of the double bed, making an explosive sound during it being thrown, and it was found face down, still ticking and working. A Bible was thrown, but the back of the cover of the Bible had been ripped off and remained on the dressing table. No one slept in the bedroom that night. The priest was to return for a second visit the next evening and stayed until the early hours. Nothing was to happen during the visit, and when the priest left the family, all was calm. It was the same for the weekend, with only slight creaking noises coming from the dressing table in the late hours of Monday night, and again at 5 a.m. on Tuesday morning. Both these noises were ignored by John, who was sleeping in the bedroom. On the evening of that Tuesday, a reporter from the Runcorn Guardian and a member of the Cheshire Society of Psychical Research kept a vigil in the house, but there was nothing seen nor heard. Nothing was reported happening in the house for around 2 weeks, but then one weekend, on a Saturday night, things started to happen again. 16-year-old John Glynn couldn't sleep very well that night as there were many disturbances, such as bangs and knocks, in his room. So on the Sunday night, his good friend John Berry said he would stay over with John Glynn in the bedroom. In the meantime, there had been a crowd of people outside the house, including some members from the Cheshire Psychical Research Society, and those members were invited into the house. There was also a priest in the house too. At midnight on the Sunday, both of the Johns heard the rumble of furniture being moved about, and it was at this time John Glynn was just lifted out of the bed and placed on the floor. He wasn't thrown, just placed, and bore no injuries to this happening. It was on the Monday night that Mr. Berry, father of John Berry, stayed the night in the house along with several ministers, including Reverend Stafford, along with others from Widnes, a town just a couple of miles away from Runcorn. At 10:30 that night, the activity began with the noise of rumbling, as though furniture were being moved. A drawer from the dressing table was pulled out and it landed upside down. The books were thrown around the room, with a dictionary hitting one of the ministers squarely on his face. There were 4 observers in John's bedroom, and one sat on a large wooden trunk that had metal handles. The trunk was seen to try and move, so this person got off the trunk and sat on the bed with the others in the room. It was then that the trunk flipped over onto its side. The 4 observers got up and, with difficulty, due to the heavy weight of the trunk, turned it back over. The trunk proceeded to be lifted from the bottom as though by invisible hands, then promptly dropped. It would then be pushed all over the floor. The consequences of this happening was that the ceiling of the kitchen below started to crack, so much so that the plaster of the ceiling fell off. Mr. Stevens was another observer and a member of the Cheshire Psychical Research Society, and he had placed his eyeglasses case and torch inside the wooden trunk. His eyeglasses case hadn't been taken out of the trunk, but he saw an object being thrown, and when he looked to see what it was his eyeglasses case. Mr. Stevens had noticed the damage to the bedroom before the activity began, and felt that it was maybe some sort of surplus energy that John Glynn gave off what that made this activity happen. Mr. Crowther, from Poole Farm, was one of the observers. He took off his overcoat and threw it over the dressing table while stating, "If you don't want it, give it back to me," and it was promptly thrown back at him. A lace cover that had been on the dressing table was torn in half, and the alarm clock was thrown so violently it was now damaged beyond repair. Mr. Stevens, during the night, asked out to who or whatever was causing these actions to knock 3 times. No knocking was heard, but the dressing table was moved 3 times to give 3 large bangs. All this activity was done in the dark with only torches for a light source. Reverend Stafford said he would add the Cheshire Psychical Research Society findings to the case, but he felt he couldn't rule out mediumistic abilities causing some of the activity. This activity carried on until around 4 a.m, so no one got much sleep that night. It was on the Wednesday that week that Lucy Jones, John Glynn's great-aunt, said it had been the worst night ever in terms of the activity. The dressing room table had been absolutely wrecked and was beyond repair. It had been found upside down, with one of the legs broken in half. It had also been pushed against the bedroom window, and the window had smashed and the broken glass had lain in the backyard. Mr. Berry had also stayed the Wednesday night, and for his troubles, one of the dressing table drawers had been thrown at him and struck him on the side of the head. He had visited the newspaper premises the next morning to show the reporters the large lump on his head where he had been hit. The Runcorn Weekly News reported on 2 séances that happened the following week. 2 of their reporters were present for both. The first séance was held away from 1 Byron Street, and Samuel Jones, John Glyn's grandfather, attended both, along with Reverend Stafford. The Reverend and the 2 reporters were there to observe and didn't join in. A circle was formed for those joining the séance, and a cone-shaped trumpet was placed in the centre of the circle. The trumpet had been coated with luminous paint, so if it moves, it is seen in the darkness. All those in the séance said prayers and sang hymns, so that the atmosphere was inviting to the spirit world. Some women in the circle said they could see spirit forms near to the trumpet. It was then that one of the attendees, a Mrs. Annie Newby, took hold of Samuel's hand, and she appeared to be in a trance-like state, and told him that the activity in the bedroom in his house was caused by an earthbound spirit, and that it wasn't wise to allow so many people into the house to witness the activity. She advised him to get together with genuine spiritualist friends and pray in the house, as that would get rid of it. Afterwards, Samuel and the rest of the séance circle and observers went to his house to perform another séance, which was performed in the bedroom, amongst all the battered items that the activity had caused. The trumpet was not used this time. Once the séance was underway, people reported seeing the spirit of a Zulu warrior. Another saw 2 small girls, both dressed in white. The group said many prayers to God, as they felt that God's power and presence would banish the evil that was the cause of all the activity. Reverend Stafford said that he thought the people who performed the séances had the best intentions, but he didn't think it would make any difference to the family's situation. He also stated that he felt the family were under a great deal of stress in having to deal with these manifestations, and whilst he wasn't a medium, he was interested in spiritualism and had been since before the war. He went on to say that he did have premonitions and felt most people have that sort of ability. He then spoke about being in the bedroom whilst John Glynn laid in the bed with his hands under the covers. There had been a box jigsaw placed on top of the dressing table. The Reverend was stood right by the light switch and switched off the light. After several moments, he heard a loud click, so he turned the light back on and saw the box jigsaw puzzle hovering several inches above the dressing table. The poltergeist strangeness wasn't contained to 1 Byron Street. An unnamed man, who was interested in psychical research, had invited John Glynn and his friend John Berry over to his house for lunch. The man's wife served all 3 men with a hot lunch and had asked what the 2 Johns wanted to drink. John Glynn had asked for a glass of lemonade, so the wife poured him one, and when she took it to the table, the glass burst into pieces in her hand as she held it. She had a small cut from the incident, which bled a little. John Berry got hit with a small spot of the liquid, but John Glynn got absolutely drenched from it. None of the liquid was found on the floor. Researchers from Liverpool attended the house one evening and had brought some recording equipment and an infrared camera, but there was insufficient activity on that particular evening. Lucy Jones's son and daughter-in-law had finally had enough of living at the property. They told reporters of what had happened the night before, which made up their minds. The 2 Johns were laying on the bed when the dressing table was lifted up and placed over them. They managed to get it off them and put it back in its original place, but it was so badly damaged, so it was in bits. These wooden bits then started to fly around the bedroom, and one of the Johns placed a pillow over his face to protect him from the flying debris, but one of the wooden pieces slashed the feather pillow, and the feathers flew everywhere. The news reporters asked the neighbours what they thought about was happening at 1 Byron Street. The main concern was the amount of people who gathered in the street after dark, hoping to get an invitation into the house. They said that there were at times up to 300 people hanging around Byron Street. One neighbour had written to the local press, saying that the household should keep its lights on all night, but their new press wouldn't get a good story from it if they did. As the case became more public, differing reasons as to why the poltergeist activity was happening in 1 Byron Street surfaced. On the 3rd of October 1952, the weekly Runcorn News printed a letter from Mr. Charles Dean, who was an official investigator at the Cheshire Psychical Research Society. He more or less accused the other investigators and the Runcorn Weekly News of sensationalising the strange happenings, and that by doing this, they were allowing the poltergeist to gather strength. He said that the point of investigating a case like this was to rid the place of the entity. He felt it was useless in trying to photograph the poltergeist, as it wasn't a ghost. He also said that the residents of the property shouldn't be allowing others to witness any of the events. Mr. Dean said he would gladly advise any serious-minded persons of the correct method to use in this case, and that the Cheshire Psychical Research Society would offer their services to the family if they desired. Mr. Dean felt the entity was of darkness, and that's why the activity only happened in the dark. His definition of a poltergeist was an earthbound spirit who had learnt to build up power and attract attention to himself. Mr. Dean had courted a lot of publicity for his exorcism of a ghost, which had for more than a century was said to have haunted an old Welsh tavern. The BBC made a broadcast of the story, which was so remarkable that, at the request of Americans, Mr. Dean made a recording of the broadcast and it was heard in the US. It was on the 10th of October 1952 when the Runcorn Weekly News reported that experts were investigating the strange events at the house. The interest in the case came from the Society of Psychical Research, or SPR for short, in London. They were investigating the case through Reverend Stevens, a superintendent Methodist minister in Widnes, and who had previously witnessed the activity at the house. He was appointed as official investigator. Reverend Stevens responded to Charles Dean's letter from the previous week's publication. He stated that no investigation should start with a conclusion, and found Mr. Dean to be ignorant in his claims in the letter. He also added that the photos were taken to document any flying missiles when the activity occurred. He ended the letter by saying that the investigation could be safely left in the capable hands of the British Society for Psychical Research of London. It was Reverend Stevens who told the Runcorn Weekly News about the letter he had received that week from Mrs. K.M. Goldney, who was the organising secretary of the SPR, who herself was a well-known researcher and had written books on the subject. In the letter, she asked Reverend Stevens if he would require a member of SPR to assist him, or whether it would be feasible to bring John Glynn to the SPR Centre in London. Mrs. Goldney also stressed in the letter that it was advisable in avoiding too many independent investigators, and expressed the hope Reverend Stevens would be given full facilities to carry out all his tests and inquiries. Reverend Stevens also said that he had had several telephone conversations with Mrs. Goldney, and he said she was prepared to come to Runcorn herself if his experiments, carried out under test conditions, proved satisfactory. She would also bring an infrared telescope that the SPR used for experiments in the dark. He also added they had discussed the fact that there had been no more activity in the house for several days. Reverend Stevens said that a period of no activity was in accord with the histories of similar cases investigated by the SPR, But this did not mean that the same set of rules could be applied to all cases, as there were slight differences in all of them, many of which were very important. Due to the scientific observation of these cases allowed for several eminent people to produce theories which none are accepted and all are open to criticism. One of these theories included Dr. John Layard, an eminent psychiatrist who thought the phenomena could be explained by tension and neurosis in the subject. John Glynn had undergone tests which showed no neuroses, although it is a state which can be hidden. Sir William F. Barnett was an eminent researcher in his field and had succeeded in a code of communication with poltergeists by the means of raps. He concluded that by using this method, he discerned that the responses were that of a childish matter, and this led him to believe that these poltergeists were partly manifested from the subconsciousness of a child's mind. Reverend Stevens added that other poltergeist cases were unconnected with any particular person and were due to outside influences. On an official investigation letter, it stated that John Glynn had received numerous letters from around the world. Many of the letters are asking for permission to visit the property so they can witness the events. That morning, John Glynn had received a plastic crucifix through the post. It was intended to be used as a talisman or lucky charm. John Glynn spoke of people who were still suspicious of the activity happening. He said he had invited 4 people to sit on him whilst he lay down on the bed. The 4 people had wanted to make sure that John wasn't the source for these activities. John said he had nothing to hide, so allowed it. The 4 people then went on to witness the activity and were now convinced it wasn't John playing tricks. John went on to tell the investigator that whatever was causing the activity could count. He said he laid on the bed and asked how many people were in the room with him. He then heard 8 knocks. John had not known how many people were in the bedroom with him, so when they were counted, there was 8 of them. John went on to tell the investigator he really wanted the whole business to finish. The investigator felt John was being sincere. John was rather fed up with it all, and to him, the poltergeist had become a nuisance. John said he is thankful when there is no activity, and he can sleep well when all is calm. An opinion piece by the columnist, The Man on a Bridge, was published in the Runcorn Weekly News on October the 17th, 1952. He wrote about a publication called The Psychic News, who had published a piece about the poltergeist in Byron Street. It criticised the Runcorn Weekly News and how it reported the case. It was said the reporting was too objective. The Man on the Bridge said Runcorn Weekly News would continue to observe the happenings as reporters, not as spiritualists. The local spiritualist group were more than happy with the way the case was being reported by the newspaper. No activity had occurred for nearly 2 weeks, only for it to start happening again. It was in the early hours of the previous Monday when John Glynn was sleeping in his bed, and he was woken up by what looked like a camera flash. It lit the room up enough for John to see his grandfather, who was sleeping next to him. John said the light come from the corner of the room and travelled between the beds, and then on to the furthest corner, then just disappeared. John was left feeling rather puzzled about this light, and it was then that the Reverend Stevens, his aunt and uncle, and a few other people come into the bedroom. They had all come upstairs as they heard strange noises coming from the room. These noises were heard when John had witnessed the light. On the following Wednesday, John, his grandfather Samuel Jones, and John's friend John Berry retired to the bedroom around 11:40 p.m. When the bedroom light was turned off, a book flew across the room and hit the grandfather. It was later on that John Glynn heard tapping on the bedroom door. He said it sounded as though someone was tapping with their finger. It would stop, then start, and went on like this for quite some time. More books were thrown as well. John Glynn said he eventually went to sleep around 2 to 3 a.m. Samuel Jones said he had felt a straining sensation off the single bed he had been sleeping in, but it had not moved. His pillow also got pulled, but it wasn't violent. A report in the Runcorn Weekly News from the 24th of October 1952 stated that a lodger at 1 Byron Street had met an untimely death. Miss Ellen Whittle, aged 59, had fallen to her death from the top of Runcorn Hill on Thursday night. She had gone for a walk with her friend Mr. Sutton when they both fell a distance of around 60 feet into a quarry. Mr. Sutton was hospitalised and recovering. The inquest into Miss Whittle's death was adjourned as the judge wanted to question Mr. Sutton about what had happened and to give his account in front of a jury. There had been no suggestion that Miss Whittle's death had anything to do with the poltergeist activities happening at 1 Byron Street. Over the next weekend, there were disturbances over the Saturday and Sunday nights. John Glynn, his friend John Berry, and another friend, Tommy Palin, was staying in the bedroom on Saturday. Books were thrown to where the two Johns were sleeping, and the single bed that Tommy Palin was resting on got moved a few inches from the wall. On Sunday night, it was the two Johns and Samuel Jones in the bedroom. More books got thrown at the two Johns. One book in particular hit John Glynn 4 times. Samuel Jones said he felt as though someone was standing by his bed, and when the light was turned on, there was only the 3 males in the room, and they were all still lying down on their beds. More knocks and bangs came from the remains of the wooden dressing table that was still in the room. It was during the same week that the BBC had come to Runcorn to interview some of the witnesses to the poltergeist activity. It was a Mr. Dennis Mitchell, senior feature producer, his secretary, Miss M. Ruse, and an engineer, Mr. W. Paines. Mr. Mitchell told the Runcorn Guardian that he wanted to interview members of the household of 1 Byron Street and those members of the public that had been in the house when the poltergeist activity had manifested. He said the recorded interviews would be a part of a special feature programme, and it would probably be aired from the North Region part of the BBC. For 3 of the interviews, Mr. Mitchell took a room at the Runcorn Guardian office, and the BBC recording car was parked outside the building, where a recording cable was fed from the car to an open window of the interviewing room. Mr. Mitchell interviewed local councillor H.W. Jones, as he had spent time at 1 Byron Street and witnessed some of the strange happenings. Mr. George Morris was next to be interviewed. He was a local newsagent, and he too had been in the bedroom where things had become violent with books and furniture being thrown. Next to be interviewed was the Runcorn Guardian manager, Mr. P. Francis. In his interview, he commented that in all of his 20 years' experience of journalism, during which he reported on many different subjects, he had never had to report on a ghost, and said what happened at Byron Street was fantastic. Mr. Payne, the engineer for the recordings, then drove Mr. Mitchell and Miss Ruse to SPR's lead investigator on the case, Reverend Stafford's abode, to record his theories on what possibly could be causing these paranormal events at Byron Street. Another witness, Mr. Jack Clark, was also interviewed. He told of one occasion in the bedroom he saw a greyish light, along with a chilling feeling on his legs. He was to describe it as though sea waves were covering his feet and his legs up to his knees. Next was for Mr. Mitchell to go to 1 Byron Street and interview the householders. For this, Miss Ruse stayed in the car and took shorthand notes of the interviews, of which could be heard in the car whilst it was being electronically recorded on a battery-operated disc recording machine. Samuel Jones was the first to talk about his experiences, and his sister-in-law, Lucy Jones, said she had been made ill by the manifestations. John Glynn described the time he was thrown out of bed, with John Berry being thrown after him. He spoke of how another person had been thrown out of the single bed and how the mattress ended up on top of him. The glass of lemonade incident was also spoken about, and how bizarre that all the lemonade ended up drenching him and him alone. It was before John Glynn went to bed that night that Mr. Mitchell got permission to place a microphone in the bedroom and another one on the stairs, and left them there all night in the hope they would record anything pertaining to the haunting. It was on Halloween, the 31st of October, 1952, when the Runcorn Weekly News reported that John Glynn had received a letter and a diagram from a Mr. Anton Blall, who was from Germany. The letter had been addressed, Family, Jones, Runcorn by London, England, and somehow it was delivered. With the letter was a magic diagram and 4 slips of paper containing magic signs and symbols, which the words Nahod and Baitendo were repeated frequently. Anton wrote that if these slips of paper were placed on objects that had been disturbed by ghosts, they will cease the activity. Unfortunately, 2 of the 4 slips of paper had been lost in the post, as the envelope had a sticker on it to tell the receiver that the envelope had been damaged or found open. John Glynn had asked the Runcorn Weekly News to help him translate the letter, and it was translated as follows.
I read the story about your ghost in the newspapers and would like to help you. We had here a similar case that lasted for 15 months. 4 weeks ago, I went into the matter and now it has gone. I have studied psychology and have 50 years' experience of this sort of thing. As I cannot come to you personally, I am sending 6 drawings provided with magic words, and they have the real power of white magic. Please put these drawings on the objects with which the ghost is interfering. The drawings are sigils, coming from high and powerful friends of the eternal world. If you do as I say, with the support of many prayers, you will have just as much success that the family here had. A friend of the other world has said, we will overcome every foe with the courage of conviction, the power of will and confidence in God. The courageous and fearless will is conscious of its own insurmountable power is what I believe in. Belief defeats doubt by its consciousness of our godly descent and by the consciousness that our own ego is of God's own ghost. This is the point where belief becomes magic, in short, the magic point of the belief. In the love of God is the pious magic, which of course, can only serve the good while it is not available to the evil.
The letter ends with the hope that the Jones family will be successful in overcoming its troubles. When the translation was given to John Glynn, he said he would be willing to give the formula a trial. He also said he would write to Anton. On Friday, the 14th of November, 1952, the Runcorn Weekly News reported that the ghostly activity was still happening in the bedroom at 1 Byron Street, despite John Glynn moving out just under 2 weeks ago. He now lives with his mother in Stenhills Crescent, Runcorn, but nothing of a paranormal nature has happened at his mother's house. He went on to say that only on the odd occasion has anyone slept in the bedroom at 1 Byron Street. His grandfather, Samuel Jones, has slept in there on Thursday night with a neighbour, Tom Paling. The men reported that books and other items had been flung around during the night. John Glynn and his friend John Berry had visited 1 Byron Street the last Saturday, and both had been in the bedroom until around 12:30 a.m. On that occasion, they heard strange intermittent noises coming from the washstand in the corner, but that was all. He had also spent another night there with his grandfather, and nothing occurred then either. The BBC would be releasing the recorded interviews with those involved in 1 Byron Street on the North of England Home Service on Wednesday the 19th of November 1952. It was a couple of weeks later that the Runcorn Weekly News reported that the SPR lead investigator for the case, Reverend Stevens, found some possible hoaxing going on with the activity. Whilst he was in the next bedroom, he heard a book fall. When he went into the bedroom, there were 3 men in the room, 1 a journalist, 1 a neighbour, and 1 a local publican. The journalist and the publican said they saw the third person throw the book after banging it against the wall. The publican said he had seen this when he turned his torch on in the room. Reverend Stevens said this might be the case, but sometimes the occupants of the house do things to encourage the manifestations. He went on to say he was not satisfied of the authenticity on all the reported ghostly goings-on, but he had added the conditions at the house were good enough for exhaustive tests for the authenticity of the reports. This being said, he had the same regards to the activity that he had witnessed when it was at its height. He said he had no doubt that the occupants of the house were genuinely disturbed by the occurrences, along with the fact that when the BBC were here, no attempt had been made to stage any manifestations, something that could be easily done in a darkened bedroom. So this led him to the belief that some of the activity was genuinely unexplainable. A letter was sent to the Runcorn Weekly News and was published on the 12th of December 1952. It was from the Gosport and Sallyport ghost hunters, asking if they could have further information about the case of 1 Byron Street. The letter reads as follows.
To the editor? Sir, this association have followed with keen interest the strange happenings at number 1 Byron Street, Runcorn, and you may be sure that we would have taken permission forthcoming an active part in investigating the alleged poltergeist phenomenon. Only the considerable distance between Gosport and Runcorn has deterred us. We would, however, appreciate any information that you or your readers could send us, as we intend to have some considerable discussion and debate on the subject. It has seemed to our members that the Byron Street haunting has some resemblance to that of Bawley Rectory, namely, being of such a violent nature. May I point out, for the benefit of you and your readers, the nature of our association? The title often tends to confuse a great many people, but in fact we are a scientific body that investigates, without any bias whatsoever, any alleged hauntings. Our members are drawn from various walks of life and are all perfectly honest observers. Again, sir, we would be grateful for any further information you could give us. C. G. Parks, Honourable Secretary. Gosport and Sallyport Ghost Hunters, care of 56 High Street, Gosport, Hants.
The case received lots of attention from those with an interest in strange happenings. I couldn't find out whether this group received any of the information they had asked for, but the last interview with John Glynn, who was still living a quiet home life at his mother's house, was to tell the Runcorn Weekly News that the activity at 1 Byron Street had become inactive. So as quickly as it started, it also finished rather quickly. Maybe it all quietened down when John Glynn left, or maybe that would have happened if he had stayed. We'll never know. And that's all for this Halloween episode, and I do hope you enjoyed listening about the Byron Street poltergeist. The next episode, episode 25, will be out on November the 29th, and it's called Gloucestershire's Ghost House. Till next time.